Hello. So since I have been creating videos related to the greenhouse gas emission, global warming, Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement are some important events in world history related to the climate change. So this video is about Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. Climate change is one of the biggest global challenges of our time. Rising temperatures, melting glaciers, extreme heat waves, floods and changing rainfall patterns are all signs that Earth's climate system is undergoing rapid change. But tackling climate change is not simple. Carbon emissions come from industries, transportation, agriculture, and energy systems across every country in the world. Because of this, climate change cannot be solved by one nation alone. It requires global cooperation. Over the last 3 decades, the world has attempted to coordinate this cooperation through international agreements. Two of the most important climate agreements in the history are Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. But how did the world reach these agreements? What scientific discoveries triggered global climate negotiations? Why did the Kyoto Protocol struggle and how did Paris Agreement change the global climate strategy? In this video, we will explore complete story of the international climate policy from early scientific warnings to the global agreements shaping our climate future. So stay till the last. The concern about climate change did not suddenly appear in the 21st century. The scientific understanding of greenhouse effect dates back to 19th century. In 1896, Swedish scientist Arrhenius calculated that increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere could raise the Earth's temperature. However, the issue gained serious attention in mid-20th century. In 1958, scientist Charles David began measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide levels at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. These measurements produced famous Keeling curve, which showed a clear and steady increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. This was the first concrete evidence that human activities were altering chemical composition of the atmosphere. By 1970s and 1980s, that rising greenhouse gas concentrations could significantly affect global climate system. This growing concern eventually pushed governments to begin discussing climate change at an international level. The first major global climate discussion occurred in 1979 during the World Climate Conference organized by the World Meteorological Organization. At this conference, scientists warned that human activities could influence the climate system in dangerous ways. However, governments still lacked a coordinated mechanism to address the issue. A major step forward occurred in 1988 when two organizations established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, commonly known as IPCC. The IPCC was created by the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization. Its role was to revive climate science, assess global research, and provide governments with reliable scientific information. The creation of IPCC was extremely important because policy needed a strong scientific foundation. The reports produced by IPCC would soon influence international negotiations. A historic milestone occurred in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This conference brought together leaders from more than 170 countries to discuss environmental protection and sustainable development. One of the most important outcomes of this summit was adaptation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as UNFCCC. The UNFCCC had a clear objective to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a relevant level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. However, the convention did not impose legally binding emission reduction targets. Instead, it established a framework for future climate negotiations. Countries that joined the convention agreed to meet regularly through a system known as Conference of Parties, or COP. The Conference of Parties meeting became the main platform for negotiating international climate agreements. After the creation of UNFCCC, scientists continued to warn that greenhouse gas emissions were increasing rapidly. Industrialized nations were responsible for the majority of historical emissions. Because of this, many developing countries argued that developed nations should take the lead in reducing emissions. The principle became known as common but differentiated responsibilities. In simple terms, it means that while all countries share responsibility for addressing climate change, developed countries should carry a larger burden because they contributed more to the problem historically. These debates eventually led to negotiations for a legally binding climate agreement. In 1997, during the Third Conference of Parties held in Kyoto, Japan, countries adopted the Kyoto Protocol. So, what is the Kyoto Protocol? Kyoto Protocol was the first international treaty that required countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Under this agreement, developed countries were given legally binding emission reduction targets. The goal was to collectively reduce emissions by about 5% below 1990 levels during the period 2008 to 2012. Developing countries including India and China were not required to reduce emissions under Kyoto Protocol because their historical contributions to climate change were much smaller. The Kyoto Protocol also introduced several innovative market-based mechanisms, such as carbon trading, clean development mechanism, joint implementation. So what is carbon trading? Countries that emitted less greenhouse gas than their permitted limit could sell their unused emission allowances to other countries. This created a global carbon market. Clean development mechanism. Developed countries could invest in emission reduction projects in developing countries and receive carbon credits in return. For example, renewable energy installations, methane capture from landfills, energy efficiency improvements, and industrial emission reduction technologies. India became one of the largest hosts of clean development mechanism projects worldwide, attracting significant investment in renewable energy and clean technologies. Then joint implementation. This allowed developed countries to invest in emission reduction projects in other developed countries. So what were the challenges? Despite being a landmark agreement, the Kyoto Protocol faced several challenges. One major issue was the participation of major emitters. Although the United States signed the protocol, it never ratified it. As a result, one of the world's largest emitters was not bound by the treaty. Another challenge was rapidly growing economies such as India and China were required to reduce emissions. Over time, global emissions continued to rise as industrial activity increased worldwide. Additionally, some critics argued that carbon trading system allowed countries to avoid making significant domestic emission reductions. Because of these limitations, policymakers realized that the new climate agreement would be necessary, one that involved all countries, not just developed ones. So, although the early 2000s and 2010s climate negotiations continued under the UNFCCC framework, scientists warned that global temperatures were rising faster than expected. Extreme weather events and rising sea levels increased public awareness about climate change. By this time, emerging economies had also become major emitters. For example, China had become the largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world. Therefore, any effective climate change agreement needed the participation from both developed and developing countries. This realization led to a new round of negotiations aimed at creating more inclusive global climate framework, the Paris Agreement. In 2015, during the COP21 conference held in Paris, countries adopted Paris Agreement. This agreement marked a major shift in global climate policy. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement required all countries to participate in climate action. The central objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial era and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. Instead of imposing fixed emission reduction targets, the Paris Agreement introduced a flexible system. Each country submits its own climate action plan known as nationally determined contribution. These plans outline how each country intends to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. Countries are expected to update their NDCs every 5 years and increase their ambition over time. The agreement also includes provision for climate finance for developing countries, technology transfer, transparency in reporting emissions. Nearly every country in the world joined Paris Agreement, making it one of the most widely supported international treaties in the history. What was India's role in global climate agreement? India has played an important role in global climate negotiations. Under the Paris Agreement, India has committed several climate goals, including increasing the share of renewable energy in its electricity mix, reducing mechanism intensity of its economy, and expanding the forest cover. India has also announced a long-term goal of achieving net zero emissions by the year 2070. The effort reflects growing recognition that climate change action must balance environmental protection with economic development. The Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement represent two major milestones in the global effort to combat climate change. Kyoto was the first attempt to legally limit emissions from developed countries. Paris expanded the framework by bringing all nations into the climate effort. While these agreements have not solved the climate crisis entirely, they represent important steps towards global cooperation. The future of climate action will depend on how effectively countries implement their commitments and accelerate the transition towards sustainable energy and low carbon economies. Understanding these agreements help us understand not only the science of climate change but also the complex political and economic negotiations involved in protecting our planet. I hope you found this video valuable. Please subscribe to the channel. See you in next video. Till then, tata, bye bye, take care.